science, and not only what science has to offer, but how it is presently misunderstood and thus misleading humanity. This is something that I have been very concerned about for a long time, that in the name of science, we're being led into very, very serious errors, which have implications in all aspects of life. I distinguish sharply between what I call scientism and science. Science is the real thing. Scientism claims to be science, but is really ideology-driven. Our society more wary of scientism and, by the same token, open again to the great wisdom of mankind. I do not believe that the ancients were all intellectually inferior to us. On the contrary, I think it's to a large extent the other way around. And so I'm interested in re-establishing, to the extent that it is possible, some of the ancient wisdom, metaphysical truth in a very simple, abbreviated visual form. I classify it as an icon. And an icon, of course, is a way of presenting metaphysical truth in a very simple, abbreviated visual form. I consider it an icon that is simply there and very helpful if we try to understand the ultimate ontology of the cosmos. Because the cosmos has three parts: a center, an intermediary realm, and a circumference. And all the world that we know through our ordinary life, our five senses, is just that circumference. There's this vast intermediary realm that we normally do not experience. And then there's a center, which also we normally experience only in a very, very partial way. So it's a symbolic representation of the integral cosmos, which is tripartite. Spiritus are the Latin words. Corpus, anima, spiritus are the Latin words. And the easiest way to explain why it is tripartite is because man himself is tripartite. Corpus, anima, spiritus are the Latin words. The intermediary is a realm that is subject to the condition of time, but not of space. And in the ancient world, that intermediary realm was fairly well known to the great philosophers and spiritual figures. But the knowledge of this intermediary domain has almost completely vanished in the Western world. In the Orthodox Church, there is a certain reference to what they call the aerial world. So they recognize it. They recognize that it's a dangerous place because, believe it or not, demons, that is not a medieval superstition, it's a reality. They are there, unfortunately. And that is their native realm.
There's an awful lot of talk nowadays about using psychedelics to interrogate the spiritual world. When people take psychedelics, do you think that they somehow access this intermediary realm?
Absolutely. I have no doubt about it. And all I can say is it's a terribly, terribly dangerous thing to do because it's real and the entities that inhabit it are also real. I will mention in passing that at one point I met Father Malachi Martin, the famous author and exorcist, on a radio program, and somehow the conversation turned to the intermediary realm. And when I said that he knew all about it, he says, yes, I call it the middle plateau, because that's where you do the exorcism. You actually communicate with the demonic world from the intermediary realm. So he knew how to access that realm and had done it many, many times. The point about that center is it is really and truly the center of the cosmos, because the reality of all real things is right there in that center. It is what in the Western language we might call the aeviternal world. There's neither time nor space there. And yet the reality of all real things is actually there beyond space and time. Well, first of all, I think we need to realize that physics and modern science in general, by its very modus operandi, its intrinsic methodology, deals incurably with parts. In other words, it can conceive of a whole only as a sum of parts. And so the causality with which physics operates is a causality emanating from the parts. And you can't say acting upon wholes, because physics really has no ontological conception of wholeness. The only wholeness physicists deal with is a sum of parts. So physics is based upon atomization. And it turns out, however, that wholeness does play an absolutely essential role in the economy of life, whether the physicists know about it or not. And along with the idea of wholes, there is a corresponding causality, which I call vertical causality as opposed to horizontal causality. And I first introduced this idea of vertical causality in the context of physics. The new physics came in 1926, quantum theory, and very soon physicists realized that there's something very puzzling about quantum theory, because a quantum system in its own right is a very, very strange, bizarre thing. I mean, for example, if you have a quantum particle, it will not be located in general in any particular point in space. In fact, there's a probability that it is given any two regions in space, there's a certain probability that the particle is in that region. So these quantum particles are very, very strange entities. You can't really conceive of them except in mathematical terms. But what puzzled physicists is that when they make a measurement in an instant, as it were, this particle, instead of being spread out over vast regions of space, obtains a particular position. The measured particle is in a given place and time. And so this is something that puzzled the physicists. How is it possible for an act of measurement to collapse this probability wave and give a definite position to particles which have no definite positions before the act of measurement? And believe it or not, physicists have been kicking this so-called measurement problem around for a good 100 years, almost, more like 90. For about 90 years, they've been speculating on this with no actual solution in sight. And I came to a very simple conclusion. The reason measurement is not comprehensible to the physicist is that the measuring instrument itself is not really a physical thing. It is not the kind of thing that the physicist studies or describes in his equations. It is what I call a corporeal entity. So there is a difference between a corporeal entity and a physical object. And the difference basically is that the corporeal entity is perceptible. If you think of visual perception, it has color, it has qualities, and we perceive it. So I realized that what had happened is that the physicist had abstracted from the perceivable world. The perceivable world is real, it's not an imagination. The red apple is there and it's red, and we perceive it. But to the physicist, the red apple has become a res cogitans, a thing of the mind. So what happened is that in the 17th century, Western civilization became, as it were, controlled by one philosopher, René Descartes. He introduced a very actually weird philosophy, and it gained traction. It became the philosophy which scientists, and especially, of course, physicists, absorb, as it were, without knowing that it is a philosophy. They think it's just the way it is. And so I realized that the reason that this measurement problem continues to mystify physicists to the present day, and you should see some of the theories they evolve in order to explain it, it becomes really weird. And the reason that the physicist can't resolve that problem is that he has fallen victim to this Cartesian philosophy. And in the Cartesian philosophy, there are no corporeal entities because all qualities are relegated to the mind. So Descartes, as it were, he cut the world into two parts: res extensae, extended entities on one side, and all they are is their quantities. They are, so to speak, the world as a physicist conceives of it. That's on the outside. And everything else, everything that's not a res extensa, was, as it were, postulated to be a res cogitans, so a thing of the mind, a thing of thought. So René Descartes cut the world into these two pieces. And this has become, so to speak, the underlying philosophy which everybody who goes into physics absorbs unknowingly. And it is really unknowingly, because I find that when I try to explain what Alfred North Whitehead called bifurcation, this cutting of reality into two pieces, the mechanical, a quantitative, and the rest is all supposed to be mental. To the physicist, this is not a theory, this is the way things are. And when you try to explain it to him, he doesn't really understand it because he doesn't know any other way of conceiving the world. So what I'm saying is that in Western civilization, the intellectual class has typically been victimized by this Cartesian philosophy. They accept this not as a philosophy, but as simply the way things are, and it's a very tragic thing because, first of all, it makes life tragic. Just think, when a father or mother holds a child, according to Descartes, they're holding a res extensa. All that there is outside in space and time is a mechanism. It's a terribly tragic way of looking at life. And of course, I fully believe that it is false. But the point that I'm making is that the world of science has been duped by this bifurcationist Cartesian philosophy. So they think of the world as greatly reduced. And what I marveled when I began thinking about the so-called measurement problem is this, that as soon as you step out of this Cartesian way of looking at the world, the solution of the measuring problem is very, very simple, childishly simple, because the measuring instrument is corporeal. That means it is perceptible, it owns qualities. You can see it, you can touch it, you can hear it, give sound. Incidentally, if it weren't perceptible, it couldn't measure anything because measurement is a matter of seeing, say, a number on a screen. So what has happened is that our men of science, and especially men of physics, have been duped by a philosophy which is totally imaginary, it is totally off course. And incidentally, the interesting thing is that in essence, this Cartesian philosophy was enunciated long by a pre-Socratic known as Democritus, yes. So Democritus, before Plato, pre-Socratic, said that all the people vulgarly think there's the sweet and the bitter. In other words, there's a perceptible, but in reality, only atoms and the void. So this is the philosophy which the Platonist and Aristotelian schools completely disproved, disqualified. They were smart enough to recognize that this is just a fantasy, but it is this very same philosophy of
Democritus,
thank you. Same philosophy that emerged again in the 17th century through René Descartes. Exactly. The cosmos is hierarchic. It breaks up into different levels, and the corporeal level is actually the lowest level in the integral cosmos. It is what is represented by the boundary of that circle. That's where the cosmos comes to an end. And however, the physicist abstracts from that. He does not recognize the corporeal world for what it is. Namely, it's a sensible world, the world we perceive through our five senses. But he abstracts the quantitative part of that. So this is the effect of the Cartesian philosophy. The physicist is blinded by the Cartesian philosophy. He does not recognize the corporeal for what it is. And so he has lost the whole idea of hierarchy, and he tries to build the world out of these quantitative entities that he has defined by his physics itself defines these entities, and so they are not what the world is made of. It's the fact that the everyday things that we know and deal with in our ordinary life receive their actual reality from that central point, that eternal realm, call it whatever you will. And this is something that is in principle inaccessible to the physicist. The physicist, if I were talking now to a physicist, he might well say, I have no idea what you're talking about, because as a physicist, one cannot conceive of that wholeness, because the way the physicist understands anything that he thinks he understands, the way he understands is by decomposing something into parts. Ultimately, they are sort of atomic parts. But this, even in classical physics, the modus operandi of physics is based upon cutting things up into little pieces. It's amazing how much actual empirical knowledge you can get that way. I mean, all of our technology is based upon it. So I'm not saying that there is an invalidity here. No, there's not an invalidity. There is just a limitation. There are things that can be understood that way, but there are also other things which actually are of prime importance that cannot. So wholeness precedes parts, and the cosmos is not just an assembly of entities, it is a hierarchy. There's a verticality, there's a vertical order, which we humans should understand, because there is that vertical order in ourselves. We have the corporeal nature, we have the psychic nature, and above the psychic, we have a spiritual nature, call it what you will. It is precisely in the arts that this wholeness plays a key role. I have often, in my writing and trying to explain these things to a general audience, referred to music especially to indicate the integral wholeness of a musical composition. It's not just an assembly of notes, there's a wholeness there. And I often quote to people something that Mozart said. Mozart confided once to a friend that an entire symphony comes into my mind all at once as one thing. And then it may take him weeks and weeks to unpack it into the scores for the different instruments and so on, and the different movements. But the point is that a real symphony, say, is more than the parts, more than the notes. And this is, of course, why it's beautiful and why we sense very deep meaning in it. But the point is that this wholeness precedes the division. So the point is not only that the physicist cannot understand everything, but the point is that what he can understand is, so to speak, the bottom of things. Modern Western culture has, as it were, eliminated all the higher levels of being, and I mean, we've become sort of creatures of the mud. We're crawling around on the earth thinking that's all there is. So the blessed thing about modern physics is that nobody really believes it. I'm sure that no parent, when it holds its child, thinks that it's holding a bunch of molecules. I mean, not even the physicists go that far. But yet, in a sense, that would be the logical consequence. So the reason we founded this foundation, Philosophia Initiative Foundation, is because we recognize that this reductionism of contemporary science is not only wrong, but it is dangerous. It is destructive of all higher culture. I mean, it really shows the resilience of mankind, that it has been able to withstand that absolutely poisonous philosophy coming in the name of science and still retain its humanity with all the limitations that we see daily. We are still human beings, and that's a marvel, because if we would fully believe what quote-unquote science tells us these days, we would be ipso facto dehumanized. Quantum Enigma, I showed that the measurement problem cannot be resolved on the basis of horizontal causality, the causality known to the physicists, that in order to quote-unquote collapse a wave function, you need a different kind of causality, which I call vertical, and which acts instantaneously. So this is what happened in 1995. In 1998, when Bill Dembski came out with his book, it turns out that he rediscovered what I call vertical causality from an information theoretic point of view, and he proved that you cannot produce complex specified information by means of the causality known to the physicists, by means of what I call horizontal causality. The intelligent design movement, which came out of that rediscovery of vertical causality, I have problems with it because instead of denying the idea of evolution, which is upside down, evolution says things come from the circumference of the circle, and all the world's great philosophy and theology says just the opposite. Things come from the center. So there is this inversion, and instead of correcting that inversion, they simply say, yes, evolution is a fact, but it requires a different kind of causality. And so this is unfortunate. They've missed a great opportunity to help straighten out our civilization. They're not doing that. Dembski's theorem is much more general, and it is what I found years later, which simply says that horizontal causality cannot produce irreducible wholeness. Irreducible wholeness can only be generated by vertical causality. Information theory is to quantize information. And I'm not denying that information does have a quantitative side to it or aspect, but you lose everything above the level of quantity that way. In other words, as always, modern science looks at the bottom of everything. And it is based upon the metaphysical assumption, which is one of the worst errors ever conceived by the mind of man, is based upon the assumption that things evolve bottom up. This is why, for example, we believe in Darwinian evolution when in fact all the evidence is against it. I mean, I know of no theory which has been as abundantly falsified as Darwinism. All the facts speak against it, and yet this has no influence whatsoever on the academic community. It's a dogma which they are not willing to give up. It shows me that there is something behind modern science. There is something, well, to put it very, very plainly, I do believe that there are not only good spiritual forces, there are also bad spiritual forces. And it is my conviction that many of the modern dogmas of science are ideology-driven from below.
Right.
Officially, science is supposed to be value-free. When you are being introduced into the basis of science, that's one of the things you're told, that we're just basing ourselves on the facts. This is a lie. It's a falsehood. Science is not value-free. There is a telos, a purpose behind it, so that actually science has an ideological basis. And when it claims to be value-free, that is not the truth. And the deeper you go into this subject of the foundations of science, the more you realize how decisively ideology plays into the equation, plays into the picture. So the great catastrophe of contemporary Western civilization resides in the fact that the educational system has been taken over almost lock, stock, and barrel by people of a given ideological bent. It's in a sense the worst of all ideologies, because one of the things that I experienced so deeply, I feel it is part of a human being to have reverence. There must be something that the human being approaches with folded hands. If you don't know how to fold your hands, you're not human. And this is what the first thing that the universities drive out of you. You become cynical, skeptical. You think you are so brilliant, when in fact, metaphysically speaking, you're a moron, a complete illiterate. So the universities do inestimable damage. We send our children there to be formed. And what a catastrophe. They come out much worse than they were when they went in. The thing is to love what is beautiful, to believe in what is good and what is true, and to reject everything that is opposed to that. And when I entered the universities in this country, it's no better over there, incidentally, but that's where I got my education. I got it in this country. As soon as I entered the university, I realized that it was just the opposite way around. They were, for example, teaching relativism. I like boogie woogie, you like Beethoven. It's all the same. No, it is not. So, because I came with certain, the old classical, mainly Germanic culture, and then the spiritual. I mean, not to think of something higher than the animal existence here on earth is to be subhuman. And I felt this, and I felt our universities were making us subhuman. They were making these young people far worse than they were when they came into the university. Instead of strengthening their higher instincts and aspirations, the university was trying to wipe them out, as if this was something illusory and incompatible with Einstein's relativity or some ungodly thing. I was a foe of the universities all my life, and yet I couldn't get away from them. I spent my life in the universities, but I'll say this, I was in the universities, but I was never off the university. It has to be done to put good ideas in their head, to form them. I mean, this is one of the things that differentiates man from the animal. The animal has instincts. A young monkey knows exactly how to climb a tree and so on and get his bananas. He doesn't need to go to college. In the human world, it's different. We do need education, we do need formation, and by and large, that education, that formation has been disastrous. I mean, you can produce somebody who knows cyber technology and can work with computers, and that's wonderful. I admire it. I have nothing against that. But not at the cost of his most precious, most sacred intuitions, which are, as it were, rooted out from him by force. He thinks of his professors as wise people. No, wise people, they are not in general. They're not wise at all. They have a technical competence in this, that, or the other. That's fine, but not at the cost of a fundamental indoctrination which, as it were, makes people profane. As I say, if you can't fold your hands, you're not a human being. To be open to what is above us.
Exactly.
And this is why that scientific education is so diabolical, because instead of looking up, you think that everything comes from below, everything comes from particles and so on and so forth. I love physics, and I spend enough of my time studying it and also writing papers in it, but not at the cost of what is sacred and what is truly human and worthy of the human.